Jake.
And I'm Steven.
Welcome to Tales from the Sask Graveyard, where we talk to employees at tech companies that are in the middle of the bell curve, not going out of business, but definitely not hitting the big time. The Sask Graveyard is a purgatory populated by companies that have made it to annual revenues in the 30 to 50 million range, but can't get to the next level, which is pretty impressive outside of Silicon Valley, but it's frowned upon here.
We interview folks in various roles about their experience working at companies like this. We're looking to see what common themes emerge across industries and roles. Today, we'll spend time with our friend Mr. G, who worked in sales for a company that sold software to law firms. Now, Jake, have you ever had a job in sales?
So one of my first jobs out of college was working for a small organic foods company. And so I was really passionate about the product, and so I really loved, like, I would even do demos in stores about the product, and I'd talk to consumers, I'd talk to the stores, I'd talk to distributors, and really enjoy that aspect of explaining, like, why this is something that they should either purchase for themselves or stock in their store. And so it wasn't a role that I sought out. I took a job that was supposed to be more around operations, and it just turned into sales. But I did that for 2 years.
Wait, Jake, it sounds like you love this role, and I know that you're now a product manager. Why did you quit?
Well, so I just talked about the part that I really loved about the job, but as the company was growing and the longer I was in it, there was a lot of aspects I didn't like about the job, and that was, negotiating about prices. So saying, if you buy 10 cases, I can give you a 15% discount, and also there was a lot of relationship building, and I'm more of an introvert, and I couldn't see myself doing that on a regular basis as part of my career of being friendly with people who I didn't necessarily like. So I enjoyed the experience. I'm glad I had it, but I knew it wasn't my long-term career. How about you? Have you done anything in sales?
The only thing I've done in my role that was kind of like sales was when I was running the donation phone for my high school. So pretty much, just cold calling alumni, asking for donations. Realistically, most of it was not asking for donations and just hearing the ringtone and then getting to voicemail, and getting a few people to answer just to say, hey, please don't call me ever again. I did have this one opportunity that there was a hot lead for a college I wanted to go to. The president of that college went to my high school, but unfortunately, that hot lead went to another caller. So I didn't get to leverage that.
Now, that all sounds pretty rough. Did that scare you away from ever thinking about pursuing something in sales, or were you open to it after that experience?
I think, it scared me good. I was just kind of pacing around a staff member's office, kind of with it on speakerphone, just waiting for someone to pick up. It was very much like a very exciting moment when someone did, but the time in between was too much for me. And that was my last sales experience.
All right. Well, enough about us. Let's talk to a true sales professional. Mr. G, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Looking forward to sharing more.
All right. So we're going to get into your time at YrDoc. But before we do, what were you doing professionally before joining there?
Yeah, so right after college, I was doing some finance work at a nonprofit and then at a bank. I took a break from corporate life for a little bit and actually worked at a farm to table restaurant for about 2 years. And then right before I joined YrDoc, I was also doing sales. It was more of a full cycle position in the pharmaceutical industry.
And so when you were looking for a job, what was it that you were looking for?
Yeah, I was looking definitely both for stability and growth opportunities in terms of career. The previous position that I had, there wasn't any upward mobility. The industry, um, there's just like not much innovation in the vitamin industry, at least the part I was in, that interested me at all. So I definitely wanted a career that was also engaging, and that's definitely why I kind of looked towards the tech field and also have some friends, a fair amount of friends who work in the tech industry. And then also just from talking with friends and a couple of people that they put me in touch with, I just saw a lot of career growth opportunity at something that I felt I was pretty decent at.
And so then how did you first hear about YrDoc?
I think just a job posting. Yeah, originally there was a job posting I'm trying to remember the order. I did actually connect with one of a classmate, alumni classmate from the same year as me from college, who was working at a company that was acquired by the company that YrDoc owned. Um, well, I guess we can call that that other company MyDoc. Um, so MyDoc owned YrDoc, and he worked at a different company that had been acquired by MyDoc. So he got to tell me about like the parent company kind of I guess leadership. He had a lot of good things to say overall about the parent company and the direction that they were heading in. And I kind of viewed the position at YrDoc as a leg into my doc.
Got it. And so, what was the interview process like?
So I originally interviewed for an account executive position. I believe I had one pretty quick phone. Oh yeah, I had a quick phone interview with um, one of the recruiters from YrDoc, and then they ended up setting an in-person interview. Uh, I think like a week later with the hiring manager for the team that I'd be working on and the sales director. Um, I think the first interview I had, it wasn't super close to where I was living. It was outside one of the major cities. So it was like I think it was about an hour and a half drive, and very early in the morning also. Um, but yeah, so the first interview, I met with the hiring manager. I was expecting to do role play, just it's a sales position. I was expecting to do role play.
Hmm.
Didn't really happen much. Definitely like went into my experience and my success the at the time my current position. And then I met with the sales director. He had me do some brief role play, but it was really more just walking through like my current sales pitch at the company that I was working for. Typically, like the sales process at the current company was a cold phone introduction, and then setting up an in-person meeting. This was pre-pandemic, obviously. And once I had the initial interview with the sales director, he actually had me walk around and meet a couple of the managers on the other teams, like the business development team, which is where I actually ended up working. I'm sure we'll dive into that. But so I met that manager, and I think I met the marketing director. Um, Definitely had really good conversations, really nice people. Um, Definitely like classic tech company, somewhat relaxed vibe, but felt like they were still also getting things done.
And now, in my experience, when they introduce you to extra people during the interview process, that means it's gone fairly well. So, did you feel fairly good about how things were going?
I both felt fairly good about how things were going, and also, I guess, a little surprised. I had prepped a lot further for the interview than I felt like where the interview went, and like the biggest thing was definitely I thought I was going to have a much more kind of um, I don't know, thorough role playing interview.
And so, did an offer come from that set of interviews, or was there more that you had to go through?
I did have one more interview where I came and met with the hiring manager, if I remember correctly, and said hello to a couple of people again. Um, and the one thing, the area where I was moving to is definitely has like a very the rent is very competitive, and I remember that being something that actually stood out from my first interview. Was the hiring manager said like one of the prerequisites for coming back for the second interview was that I had found a place to rent before I had the second interview, which I was a little amused by, especially like I grew up in Hawaii. I'm quite familiar with expensive rent and low availability. So I was just
Mhm.
a little bit amused by that. And also that I wouldn't have already thought of that. I think at the time had like 5 showings set up.
So
Um,
you didn't need to have a signed lease. You just need to show that you were like actively like looking in the market.
yeah, I don't think I ever like needed to show any
Yeah.
paperwork, but I think they were legitimately expecting me to accept the job offer and then have nowhere to live. Which I mean, I do think I also kind of lucked out based on my timing. It is definitely like also a heavy college area, and I think just like based on my timing, I started in March, and so I think the timing just worked out on my side. I don't know.
So once you got the offer, were you excited, or did you have other offers at the same time?
I didn't have other offers. I was definitely very excited. My previous role, on top of just not being fulfilling and not where I wanted to go, we were frankly running into issues. So I was definitely very excited for uh, the position. I didn't have any offers. It was definitely, I would have liked to have had a couple of offers bounce off of each other, but just happened pretty quick. And there wasn't anything else that I was actively looking at. So I just figured, worst case scenario, I'll take this. And if something else comes along, then I'll go for that.
Got it. So would you say that it was more about you were excited to be leaving your previous job as opposed to excited about YrDoc? Was there excitement about YrDoc as well?
I wouldn't say there was so much excitement about YrDoc. I mean, it seemed like a pretty decent company. I would say there's more excitement around the ownership from my doc. And because YrDoc, I think, made up like between 8 to 10% of my doc's revenue. So, yeah, in terms of YrDoc, the company that I was directly working for, I wasn't disappointed by the offer, but I wasn't particularly excited by it. So I'd say it was a combination of that, and then also definitely excitement to leave my previous job.
Are there any questions you wished you had asked during your interview process, or things you learned about YrDoc before accepting the role?
I wish I had been a lot more thorough about their onboarding expectations. Um, Basically, what I ended up running into was I had sales experience, but I didn't have much training at all. And I was very upfront about that. Um, and it is a transition. Like with tech sales, most of the closing that you're doing is on the phone and with a demonstration of a software product.
Hmm.
Whereas with my previous role, I largely just negotiated price and coordinating delivery of the product. I had like a technician who handled everything else. So I I wish I'd been more thorough about asking about their onboarding process because I didn't feel like I got the training that I could have benefited from. And yeah, I think that would have been the main question I'd asked about, even if just so I could prepare myself better for learning to demo software beforehand.
Got it. No, one question I have is, I'm not in sales, but
Hmm.
work at tech. I have worked at a variety of tech companies, and it often feels like there's a very like high churn rate on salespeople. That there's often just like get people in and then send them out. Is there anything about the interview process where it feels like, oh, if you're sort of like they're not really committing to you, but they're just going to bring you in to see if you can survive? Was there any sense of that?
A bit. I definitely, I've only at this point worked at two tech companies, and both of those experiences, like I didn't. Yeah, so yeah, the thing that led me a little bit to feel like they were just putting me in to test me out and see what happened was, um, like they were fully familiar with my sales background, and I think the sales director had another person that had left the pharmaceutical industry and joined tech and had been pretty successful, and then had a couple of other people who had done the same thing and like totally flopped. And he was very straightforward with me about that.
So was that did he present that as a way to like try and have you convince him that you would not be a flop, or he was just as a word of warning?
Both. I mean, that's why I was a little bit more surprised about the interview process, that there wasn't a little bit more like role playing. like I was surprised that I wasn't even presented with a scenario. Like in the interview, I was sort of presented with a scenario related to YrDoc, but as my understanding goes, like I feel like a lot of other companies present like specific scenarios and how you would handle that, and I was pretty surprised that I didn't get that. But yeah, so both in the interview and then also as a kind of word of warning as well.
Yeah, Mr. G, now that you've got the offer, you've accepted it. Tell us about that first month. Did you get any training at all, or did they let you just sink
Mm.
or and struggle to swim?
There were training resources. I will say, so the first month, I definitely got the impression that I was like following the path that they had, so to speak. Um, so yeah, they had some video training sessions on sales, which actually were very helpful in terms of the sales process and questioning. I'm trying to remember. As far as I remember, there wasn't really much training on the product. I had already done a fair amount of research on the product, just like I set up my account before I was supposed to. I'm sure I disappointed someone on the sales team by not being the lead that they were hoping for. Um, but yeah, so the kind of product learning, there was a little bit of kind of like an outline of what I should focus on, but there wasn't any direct help on that front. Um, Definitely, most of my training was from a colleague who was theoretically like at the same level as an account executive, but from the manager. Um, the manager would check in with me and was definitely like I did feel like for that first month that I was pretty well on track. And I didn't necessarily know that I should have been asking for a lot more. But in retrospect, I should have been asking for a lot more hands-on training from the manager.
So your main buddy was kind of someone at your same level, and that they were your go-to person to help you learn the ropes.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is like that person was very helpful, but I think also at the end of the day, that person is not responsible for my quota. That person is not responsible for determining if I'm up to par for the role. I think it would have been unfair for him, even though I did ask those questions. I think it would have been unfair to like really have him be the decider. I'm sure to some extent he might have had some input. I'm not sure what that looked like. Um, but yeah, most of my training was from that colleague. Um, and it definitely, while the training was definitely very helpful, it didn't seem like there was even a connect between my colleague and the manager of like where I should be at.
How many other people were at your level?
I believe there were 9 or 10 people on the account executive team at that point. It was also the dynamics of the team were very interesting too because they're I don't know how accurate these accusations are. For lack of a better way of saying it, I'm a white dude. One of the people on the teams was a black woman, and she mentioned very vocally that she'd kind of like been placed where she felt like in a part of the office where she was like just shown off as a token person in tech, essentially. Um, and there, but at the same time, she was also, in my opinion, like she would publicly um I think there's a line between like disagreeing and telling off your manager publicly in front of like 50 to 100 employees. And that happened pro- at least 4 or 5 times where she flat out said like she thought that the strategy of the sales, not even her manager, but the sales director was stupid. So not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but there were just very interesting team dynamics with those 9 people. That particular person ended up leaving within 2 months after me joining. Um, and then also there was another team member who had joined just before me, who was, I think, probably about 7 or 8 years older than I was. And that was also some of the weird direction. Like I kept getting direction from both my manager and the sales director to shadow this newer person because she seemed to be doing pretty well, and the newer person didn't like feel like she was in a place to be handling me shadowing her. So it was definitely yeah, there's just a little bit of dynamics that were hard to navigate.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there's some tension in the
Yeah.
org.
Oh yeah, I would say at that particular point there definitely was tension. Like I've definitely been through other points where I didn't feel like there was that much tension. Like I felt like the team was much healthier, but at that specific point there was definitely tension on the team.
And were you already expected to carry a quota in your first month?
No, so my quota didn't start until I think it didn't start until the second month, which in retrospect, that's definitely, I don't think they would have negotiated on that, but I'm thinking that's also probably something I would have at least tried to negotiate. Because, at least from my understanding and having watched very successful team members onboard onto that team, like 6 months is a much more reasonable expectation. But yeah, so I had like a guaranteed commission for the first month. I think the second month guarantee commission wasn't quite like quota based off of sales, but like based off of success of like preparing yourself for the sales role. And then the third month was fully based off of you meeting quota.
Were there any other red flags that you noticed in your first month?
No, I mean, one thing I was a little confused about was I didn't have a clear understanding of what the revenue of our specific company was because it was owned by a much larger company. So it was definitely a little bit unclear as to like where we stood and where we were going. But I think that yeah, for the first month that was definitely unclear, but I think that's also regardless, even if you have a clear understanding, there's just in a new job, there's a lot of information coming at you.
Mm-hmm. And was there any other impressions of your colleagues you had? Were you all? It sounded like you were pretty separate most of the time, but was there? Did you get to interact much with them?
Yes, and to be frank, actually, like I got in a little bit of trouble for interacting too much. I kind of thought, I mean, one of the reasons that I joined the company was I wanted camaraderie and colleagues. At my previous role, it was just me, myself, and I, and my manager. Um, and in the beginning, like the sales director did mention, like, you know, you need to get to know everyone's names because you're going to be working across many different teams to get these sales done. And I guess I took that a little bit too far. So I mean, you know, there definitely were some, I guess, corporate lessons for myself that I learned. Like there's definitely like corporate growing up on my end that happened for sure. But I don't, yeah.
Can you mind doing a little bit like more in detail on that? Like, what was this? Were you like infringing on other people's time, and sort of like that was viewed as then preventing them from getting their job done, or
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was just like kind of like going back to the like, we'll see if you can float. I think it was just kind of like a result of the situation that I couldn't float. And I think that like if I had been more successful, then I don't think it would have been as big of an issue. But so basically, what happened was I, going through my transition because I did transition from an account executive to a business development rep, which also, just to clarify, was the original position that I had applied for. I originally applied for a business development rep, and they hired me as an AE, which at the time I wasn't upset about. Um, but so yeah, what happened was my second month was when there was like that demo practice, and I did get to practice both watching and kind of presenting um, a couple of demos with that colleague that I was shadowing. Um, and I definitely should have asked more questions to be clear, but it was also not clear the process I thought like my first demo was basically just a demo to see where you're at, and then we'll coach you to improve. Um, and I definitely the first demo was basically just to make sure that I could like had everything down and was ready to go and sell. So there's definitely a disconnect on my side and from the management side of like where I thought I was supposed to be and where I actually needed to be. And I found that out very quickly after the first demo did not go so well. They like immediately put me on a performance improvement plan. Um, and then 2 weeks later, a bit of an improved demo, but just not where they wanted me. I think they probably knew 2 weeks before that they were like pretty well set up. They wanted me to transition to a different role. Um, and yeah, and then they offered me the business development role, and they said like if I didn't want to take it and I wanted to go take another job, that they understood, but that they did really appreciate like I forget how they phrase it, but basically that I meshed well on like a social level with the team, and they would like to still have me at the company. And basically, you know, it would just be like 12 months, and then if I, as long as I was performing, then I could be on the account executive team. Um, I ended up just taking that role again because of the ownership from I guess YrDoc for YrDoc. And also like that was my initial approach to switching into tech sales was to start as a BDR and just like first of all get like legitimate sales training and you know spend a year working my way from the bottom up. So even though I was definitely very disappointed to be like transitioning down, that was originally my plan in the first place. So it just felt like it made sense to continue with a company that for the most part, like most of the people, even though I felt like some of the management was very unclear on the specific sales team, I felt like overall it was still a pleasant place to work. So I ended up taking the BDR role.
Got it. It seemed, yeah, it definitely seems like management very unclear and lacking transparency. That's
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it was there's definitely a lack of transparency. Like at least from my perspective, I was definitely confused about where things were at. I definitely wasn't like looking back. I wasn't ready for that particular role, and I thought I was going to get more training for that particular role. Um, but the process definitely could have been better.
yeah. And so when you transitioned to the BDR role, what were you spending the majority of your workday on?
um, Making cold calls. Um, yeah, that was basically the majority of my day was making cold calls to lawyers to tell them why. I mean, you know, obviously the sales process was a lot more kind, but essentially, like if you think about the legal industry, they are very slow to change, understandably, because they're in the industry that if you do something wrong, like it will come back for you. Um, but and then on top of that, also the ABA, the American Bar Association, had I think at least until 2010 or 2012 had actively been pushing against technology. So there's definitely was this mindset that from lawyers that they weren't even allowed to be using technology. But yeah, so my day to day basically looked like making 75 calls. I'd probably get between 5 to 10 decision makers on the phone per day. And I think I'm trying to remember at the time because our quota changed. I think our quota was setting up a total of 10 demos for the month. Um, the first month I actually did really well. I started halfway through the month and I set up 6 demos. I was like at least in the halfway point of the team, the business development team at the time. So definitely, even though the transition didn't feel great, I definitely felt like I was in the right place and doing the right thing when I started. But yeah, and I guess like more specifically in terms of like what my workflow looked like once I kind of really got a hang of things. Typically, like at the start of my day, the first thing I did was check my email to see if anyone had gotten back to me with a positive reply. Definitely get many negative replies. But yeah, so the first thing was to check if I gotten back any positive replies. The second thing was just to make sure I had my schedule set up correctly for the day, check if I had any demos. If I did have any demos scheduled, I would touch base with the account executive to make sure that they could still take the meeting and what the expectations were for the call. And then once I had gotten through that process, I would probably spend between like well, actually, usually at that point of the day, because we were still in the office, we would have an entire team meeting at the beginning of the day, and it was basically like a warm up meeting to practice answering or handling objections, basically. So we'd have our meeting. Sometimes we would review things that marketing had done for us in the meeting, or give a shout out to different team members for having a particularly good demo. And then probably about 8, I'm doing the math because I know sometimes we change at times, but I think usually by 9 in the morning I would be making cold calls. If I could get some calls in earlier, either because the meeting was shorter or I managed to just get on the phone before the meeting, I would start with the East Coast right away, just because we were not based in Eastern time. And then I would sometimes do a bit of research on the companies. It was usually pretty quick. Eventually, once I got into my flow, I basically would just get a set of leads assigned to me in our Salesforce system. I think like usually I'd have 200 at a time, and I'd just call whoever was next on the list.
And this, of course, was the time, as you mentioned, where you were still going to the office. Was it an open office? Was it lively? What was the vibe of it?
There were very few walls in that office. I think the only walls I can really remember were for like a couple of conference rooms and the VP of the company. So yeah, it was definitely open floor concept. I remember at the time, I think when I had first started, we were sitting right next to marketing, and marketing doesn't spend a lot of time talking on the phone and is trying to concentrate. And so I know they moved different teams around quite a few times. And I think it just kind of became clear that most of the people in that particular building were just on the phones all the time. But yeah, so I mean, it was um, kind of somewhat typical of a tech company. There's a ping pong room. I definitely would take afternoon breaks with other team members to play ping pong, especially if people bailed on our demos. Always a fun time. There's a kitchen. There are actually 2 kitchens just on our floor. I wouldn't say I would cook an elaborate meal, but I would usually like cook something simple and bring it in. But there were tons of snacks, drinks. I remember the thing I was most excited about when I started was they had the C2O coconut water brand in the fridge. And it definitely had a fair amount of that right at the start. But yeah, so it definitely felt like at least from my expectation, having never worked in a tech office before, like a classic kind of tech vibe. It had a little bit still of a startup vibe, even though like the parent company again was much bigger, and then the YrDoc was, I think at the time, roughly around like 75, 80 people. And we were in the same building as the parent company too. So like I would walk right across the hallway, and there would be like the parent company's customer support team. So it was kind of nice also to have that like cross reference, because that was where I was intending to go at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Just because first of all, the number of positions on the other teams was a lot greater, and also it seemed a bit easier to sell on the other teams as well.
Yeah. Did the other teams of the parent company have better benefits or a better kitchen or anything like that?
Not visibly within the office. I think compensation was different. Like I think like BDR to BDR, the compensation was definitely a bit different. But in terms of in the offices, we were visibly treated equally.
Just curious. I was curious if there was a tension there.
Uh, yeah, I would say like there wasn't a visible tension, but I think that there definitely, even from leadership at YrDoc, there was definitely a bit of a tension of like, you need the cash resources to grow, and there was the growth. Like the leadership could show that the growth was doable, but I think the growth potential was nowhere near as high as the growth potential with the parent company. So I think they just didn't see the ROI, and it didn't make sense for them to put money into YrDoc.
And what is the thing you're most professionally proud of that you achieved at YrDoc?
Probably like one of the bigger deals that our team sourced at the time. So when we were sourcing deals, I think our quota, I'm trying to remember how, because our deal sizes were typically like, it was based per user, and we were typically working with law firms between 3 to 10 employees. Even getting to 10 was like, it wasn't a huge deal, but it was definitely like you got at least a shout out. And I remember that I sourced a deal with 21 employees, and I definitely remember doing the math. Like once my colleague on the account executive team, who actually was the one that was training me, he was the one that took that deal. And I remember doing the math when he told me that the deal closed, and realizing that I had kind of like broken past the break even point of like my cost to the company. So I was definitely like pretty proud of that once I realized that like the company was essentially benefiting from having me there.
That's awesome. That is something to be proud of. And then was there any other days that were super memorable to you?
Yeah, some good, some bad. We definitely like there definitely were some like big growth achievements that happened, but it wasn't on our team. So it was more on the payment side. Which like at the time anyways, I think there were 2 people dedicated to the payments team, and I think they were kind of bringing in um, somewhat equivalent numbers just because of like the functionality. Like the 2 people were bringing in similar numbers to the 10 people sourcing all of the new business just because of the functionality of how payments works. So it was definitely like it was a good thing. It felt good for our company. Like we were achieving milestones in other departments, and it's not that our department at the time wasn't doing well, but it did just feel like the greater potential was on other teams. So I definitely remember like some of those milestones. Like for the most part, we did achieve those milestones, but they definitely seemed, again, like the leadership would have liked to have set much bigger milestones, but just didn't have the resources to do it. And then so those were the positive ones. I do remember also like, sales is hard. Even when I was doing really well, sales was hard. I remember like the first month that I didn't make quota, which, um, first of all, like a decent amount of our team would make quota at some point, but it was definitely not easy to do. But I remember like the first time that I didn't make quota still, like I remember the end of the month, it was close to my dad's birthday, and the one deal that was supposed to get me the quota like ended up bailing, and I just I said it. I was like, well, this sucks. It really, in the scheme of things, wasn't that big of a deal, but I just had such ambitious goals to be the first person to move over to the account executive team from the BDR team. And I knew that like kind of for sure guaranteed that wasn't going to happen. So it definitely was like at the time a big bummer. Um, um, and then the other thing though was like being in a sales team, it is really hard. Overall, I was definitely one of the top performers, and I do remember trying to help other people who were struggling, because even when you're a top performer, sales isn't easy, and it's definitely sucks when you're not, but when you're towards the bottom of the pack. And there were many in the 2 years I was on that BDR team. I think like the total size of our team was usually around 10, and I think I saw a total of maybe like 15 people join the team, and I feel like at least 7 or 8 of them leave the team, um,
Oof.
just because they couldn't perform, and some of them it wasn't by choice. And I remember most specifically the first time that happened, and one of my colleagues had been on and off. Not that I was like necessarily supposed to be aware of this, but I knew that he was on and off performance plans for, I think, like 6 months. And I sat right next to him. Like I knew he was not happy even when he was succeeding. And I knew he didn't feel good about like the job in general. And it definitely like he was a nice person, and it also was a total like energy suck. Like it, no one on the team wanted to see him leave, and also after he left, everyone on the team definitely felt like a little bit of a weight was lifted, and I definitely remember that very specifically.
Ooh.
Yeah. So I mean, but I think it speaks to sales. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I do like about sales. Like, I did not vibe well with finance. Like, I can do Excel. I hate it so much. But with sales, at least in these roles that I've had, first of all, I really enjoy talking to people. And also, like, you're, I mean, in certain sales role, you definitely coordinate a lot more with other people. But at the end of the day, your work speaks for itself. Um, and sometimes it's really hard. And also, like, I've talked to so many people who either have been considering sales or who have left sales. And like the thing I always try and drive home for them is just like, first of all, like I haven't always been successful in sales. But when I see people who like are very defeated when they leave sales, I try and remind them that sales is brutal, and there are many other jobs out there that one are much more friendlier than sales, can potentially even pay better than sales. And like just because one job didn't work for you doesn't reflect on you in any way, shape, or form. It just means that this was not a good choice. That's all.
One question I have on you mentioned like not making your quota the one time, realizing like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm not gonna become or this isn't the best way to become an account executive. Was there anything else from management about was there like sort of any repercussions of not making a quota?
Um, Not too much. There was disappointment from my direct manager, mostly just because I think he wanted me to succeed. I will say my direct manager on the business development team, he like really stuck out his neck for me, um, in many situations. So yeah, that was a good experience. But in terms of like that, like over the course of the 2 years I was there, I probably missed quota. Trying to remember. It was at least 3 months. I don't think there were too many more months above that. Um, but yeah, aside from like management, like it was just a clear conversation. My boss, like, he was kind about it, but he also just like he made it clear. He's like, yeah, it probably like put you behind a bit on how fast like you get to account executive, because when I first started, like there's a possibility as a BDR, there's a possibility of like just moving back up after 6 months. And after that particular month, he was like, well, it's going to take a bit longer after that.
Yeah.
But aside from that, and the kind of like the initial slight delay, like it still only seemed like it was an extra couple of months before a potential promotion. And then like it was a little bit less in commission, but aside from that, there were no big repercussions.
In your time there, did anyone move from a BDR to become an account executive?
Yeah, so 2 people did move to BDR to an account executive. I know for both of them, it was pretty hard. I remember they basically, as far as I'm aware, had a similar onboarding experience as I did. I have friends who work at other companies like Salesforce who have been on sales teams, and they were like I was talking to them about the onboarding process, and they were kind of um, a bit perplexed about like the process. Like typically, it doesn't always make. I mean, I don't know if there's a typical in sales, but at least the way that I would have liked to have transitioned from a BDR to an account executive would be like you get small enough accounts that don't qualify for our sales team to practice on. And then like once you start closing some of those, then you get promoted. Like, and I know some companies do that. And I think it would have made things a lot easier both for management as well as the potential to move up in the company if they had done that. That being said, it's like I know those conversations happen on the managerial level, and I just always kind of wondered why that like wasn't something that was tried, because I know like I was much closer with the second person from our team that moved up from a BDR to an account executive role, and it sounded equally as stressful as my experience, even though like the only difference was they managed to like produce, have the opportunity to produce, and were doing a little bit. But I think it was just, yeah, the two people that transitioned directly to the BDR, from BDR to account executive role, those happened within 3 months of each other. So one was in December, and one, I guess it like was finalized in June. So the first person to move from our team was in December of 2019, and then the second person was in either May or June of 2020. And then no one got promoted from that role at all in the time that I was there for the next year.
Over that next year, how are you then feeling about your position at YrDoc, where you're not seeing, you know, any of your colleagues move up, and are you wondering about your own chances of moving up at that point?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even in December when the first person moved up, I had a conversation with my boss and I said like, look, I want to be the next one. At that point I'd been like pretty successful, like staying either at quota or close to quota. And I knew there was like one or two people that were slightly outperforming me, and I wanted to perform at least 1 or 2 months ahead of them. And I did that in January and February. And then my colleague ended up getting promoted. And it was a little tough for me, to be honest, because I was pretty close with that other colleague. Like we hung out a lot, and definitely like relied on each other. Um, and she was younger than me. And so it did feel, even though like it was totally ego on my part, like when you average out the numbers, she did perform better than me. It did feel like a slap in the face when she got promoted. Um, but I mean, also sales speaks for itself. So when she ended up getting promoted, I again went to my boss and was like, I want to be next in line. And at that point, he said, look, like you are clearly the next person in line. Like just continue doing the work. And this, like that conversation was happening like right towards the beginning of COVID. At that point, we had like just gone remote. I continued to do pretty well at that point. Like we had been promoted, or I think it was myself and my other colleague who had gotten promoted to an accounting executive. But at that point, I had moved up from a level 1 BDR to essentially a level 3 BDR. So I did get a little bit of a pay bump. My boss definitely let me know like I was in a good place. Um, and at that point, I was also having a conversation with my boss about working on the parent company sales team,
Mm-hmm.
because he just felt like that's where he came from. He felt like their growth team would be a really good fit for me. And he was really pushing that. And I was like, okay, like if that's going to be easier for me and I'm going to make more money, like that's where I want to focus. And I'm going to just keep producing. And kept producing. And I remember like it got into the late summer, and I told him, like, I was like, I'm not looking around at anything yet, but like if opportunities don't open up, like I'm gonna go, start taking a look elsewhere. And he said like that made sense to him. And then in September of 2020, a private equity company came along. It was very abrupt. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, the leadership at YrDoc, as far as I'm aware, they had like a couple of days extra heads up than us about the private equity. Like the parent company definitely made its own decision. As far as I'm aware, didn't really inform too many people. And then like I think we had like between 10 and 15 days before we were acquired and
Got it.
when we
So
found out.
so MyDoc sold off YrDoc, so
Yeah.
that potential opportunity to work for the parent company went away without sale then.
Yep. Absolutely. I could not work for the parent company for 3 years. If I was still working at YrDoc.
Oh wow.
So that was, I definitely like talked with my boss, and it was like a huge WTF. And to be frank, like I think my boss felt the same way. Like my boss spent most of his time working at MyDocs, the parent company. And I think, and even a lot of the sales directors, like I think a lot of them, or there's only one sales director, but a lot of the leadership, I think, also felt like a bit of a slap in the face. Like it, they handled it pretty well. And, I know leadership has to put on the face, but I think emotionally they were very upset about it. And then also like, getting acquired by a private equity company, like the first thing you do is go and Google the private equity company and see if you still have a job. Um, and I remember Googling them like literally at work. I didn't care if I made the number of calls that I needed to that day. I don't think my boss cared. I remember Googling them and still kind of being up in the air because this particular private equity company, like, definitely had a reputation for, with some of their companies, like gutting companies and like just kind of selling pieces off. And then other ones they took public. So it was definitely a 50-50 of like, where is this going? And there were, of course, reassurances from leadership, but I don't really remember feeling even confident about the stability of YrDoc until like January, February of 2021.
So from the announcement of the acquisition to January of 2021, did you start looking for another role, or were you just sort of biding your time and crossing your fingers?
A little bit of both. I wasn't actively searching for other roles, partially just because I was making an okay amount of money. I wasn't struggling. Like I was the top performer on the team by a long shot at that point. For the most part, I had a good relationship with my manager, so I definitely like got a little comfy. And at the same time, I did, get LinkedIn requests for interviews for AE positions, account executive positions. I definitely took them. At that point, I was not very clear about the future with YrDocs. Like it just did not feel very stable, and I was like, I want another job in the back pocket, even if it's the same position, because I feel very confident with my capabilities in that position. And I interviewed for another company. That was one of the other things. They had a very strict plan of like, if you meet X benchmarks over the course of a 12-month period, you automatically get considered for account executive. Like there's no wishy-washy. And basically at that point, as long as there's not stronger competition, you probably get that position. I felt very confident both like with a lot of those different metrics that they were providing. But their product, it was a good product. It just felt very easily replicable. And so I ended up turning that down. And at that point, that was like at the very beginning of January 2021. And it did have a conversation with my boss because one of my other colleagues, who was a pretty decent performer, left for a different sales role. Um, and so at that point, I did have a conversation with my boss and basically pointed out, like, hey, I performed better than this other person. They were able to get a much higher paying account executive job. Like, this is definitely kind of like, unless you find a position for me, this is going to happen in the next couple months. And he, at that point, asked me to hold on. We had sort of had discussions about there was like a new sales department in the growth division. Um, and it definitely had a conversation about, like, I think you'd be a good fit, but they're hiring a new manager. And then I think like the second or third week in January, they hired a new manager for that team. And he said he'd like put in a word to like not quite have an interview with her, but like a get to know you introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And after a week went by, I basically told him pretty straightforward. I have a really good relationship with him. I was like, look, I don't want to wait for just an introduction. Like, I'm going to reach out to her. What is the most appropriate way? Because it's going to happen. Like, I'm going to do it. What is the way that you feel most comfortable with? So at that point, he like did a pointed introduction to that person. And I know he was also considering doing the same for someone else. But I think I was a bit more pushy about it. And I think also I was just more confident about it because I was performing better. And I had a really good discussion with that hiring manager. She really seemed to know what she was doing on the growth team. And then um, at that point, I think it was like mid late February, and one of my friends from college was working at the current company I'm working at, and said like, hey, this company is amazing, we have some open positions, can I put your name in? And I was like, sure, like I'm not going to say no to that. And the interviews went really well. I found out it was for still a business development position, but it was in a market that was um, it was just way bigger sales, and I was selling to like serious suite at like Fortune 500 companies instead of like a lawyer at a 3-person law firm.
Right. So
Um,
much better experience.
Much better experience. It also seemed like it was a lot less stressful. Like at this point, I'm making 75 calls a day. I can't even tell you. I've made like tens of thousands of calls at YrDoc. And at this new company, like the most I was asked to make was 25 calls, and that only lasted for a week because just kind of like goal changes. At this point, like I probably make, I don't know, 25 to 40 calls in a week, and they're very strategic, and I like work through them with a VP. Like at my current job, I'm only talking with VPs for the most part, both internally and externally. Um, so yeah, it was just like once I got offered that job, and at this point, it was like the second week of March, and I was like, there's no way, like I haven't had an interview yet internally. Like my boss at the time had asked me to wait till the second quarter, and I was like, we're basically already there. And like I feel like I got strung along for almost an extra year than I should have. So
So when you told your manager about the other offer, did he try to convince you to stay?
it was the short answer is no, but I'll dive into why. So um I'm trying to remember the order of things. I like earlier in the week that I knew I was getting the offer letter. Uh, I forget exactly what happened, but there was a family emergency. Like my boss had just finished moving to a new place, like house, and then he had a family emergency. I was like, great. So I just got this new offer. I do want to keep a good relationship with my old manager. And I get to and on top of that, I didn't get 2 weeks for to start my new job. So I was gonna give like a week and a half notice. And so he was basically out of the office. So I called his boss just to say like, hey, I want to let someone know just so the process can start, and I'm providing as much notice as possible. And also, like, our boss is out of the office on this emergency. I don't want to bother him with this stuff right now. And so that person, so that was the marketing director, he did have a pretty frank conversation with me about why I was leaving. And at the time, I did sort of think there was a bit of a title change, but I told him mostly like, compensation. Like the
Yeah.
amount that I'm getting compensated now is on par with what some of the account executives are getting paid at my old company. And he has some like other basic other exit interview type of things, but he was also on the way, I found out, to his snowboarding vacation. So we kept that pretty quick. So it's just like it wasn't at all how I wanted to leave the company. And then later my boss came back into the office and I sent him a message basically being like, I'm pretty sure you know already, but just wanted to let all of you like all of this information like in writing to you, and sorry like it's such last minute notice. And he slacked me real quick basically saying like, first of all, super happy for you, we'll connect, just really busy right now coming back. And then once we did connect, he was basically like, he just felt like he did it, like it wasn't a failure on his part because he trained me well enough for like the essential promotion that I was getting. um, and so I think he was definitely bummed, because that basically meant that there were one decent performer and then a top performer that left over the course of like 2 months essentially. And so I think it really spurred some necessity for hiring for the BDR team, which is not really the position I wanted to put him in, but also I, I he's said many times to me too, even, I need to look out for my own paycheck.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it was definitely a very short and bizarre exit process for sure.
How did your colleagues react?
Most of them across different teams were, sad to see me go. I did connect with a lot of the account executives that I like trained with originally when I was like hired as an account executive. I did have one or two of them basically say that like they felt I got put in an unfair position when I switched to the BDR role, and they said like they just didn't see how management was going to hire me back to the account executive team, which I get. And also, like, I wish someone had just said that outright. And I get also that management can't box themselves into positions, but it would have just been much more helpful for my career to know that instead of just, I mean, I know they want a top performer sourcing new business as long as they can, but from the top level leadership, and this is all speculation from other account executives, but I did feel like that was the case and they just wouldn't say it. So that part was definitely a bit of a bummer. And then at the same time, like that same person who was in charge of like whether or not I could move up, the director of sales, did message me on LinkedIn saying like, hey, like I think you have a great career ahead of you, and essentially best of luck, which I appreciated. But I was also like very frustrated by because it was like I felt like, you hired me on like the sales director at the end of the day is in charge of all of these things, and I just felt like you hired me onto this team, didn't provide the training resources, put me on a different team, and then are bummed to see me leaving because you wouldn't rehire me onto the account executive team. It did feel like I don't know if it was even intentional or not, but it felt like I was being played with.
Right. Like it felt like if you really cared, you had 2 years to like do something about it.
Yeah, you literally have the decision making power to do something about it. And it's like, in the long run, no hard feelings to
Right.
that particular individual, but it definitely was very frustrating in terms of my career path.
So I think we've come to our favorite ending closing question. So if we had a time machine and you can go back to March of 2019 and you have that offer from YrDoc, would you still take it?
Yeah, I definitely would still take it. I probably would have approached it a lot different knowing what I know now, But my goal going into that role was to, first of all, have a stable job, and second of all, to get into the tech industry as a sales rep um, with sales curriculum that I could reference under my belt. And I definitely got more than that. Like, I got some really good training from my manager. I think probably the thing I might have done differently um, is just applied for other jobs a lot sooner, like probably 12 to 13 months in instead of 24. Um, but I am very grateful to be at my new role. It's definitely, I'm learning a lot more. Um, not that money is everything, but I'm getting paid a lot more. Like, I think I'll use it in percentages just because it was a big deal for me. It's definitely the most that I've ever made. It was like close to a 40% pay change. Um, so it was just, yeah. Yeah. I mean, making that change. And on top of that, like the percent that is commission is very small. um, and my current, uh, we refer to them as monthly business objectives, are so easily achievable. Like, I've definitely feel like I've sourced a lot of great opportunities already 3 months into my new role. And I feel like my current manager is very clear both about like what my goals are to become an account executive or sales rep, and has been putting me in positions where I can pitch directly to literally VPs at these big companies, and is continuing to put me in situations where I learn closing techniques and get um, essentially get the numbers onto my resume that show that I can do it too. So it's definitely, it's been a journey to say the least. Certainly, a lot of YrDoc's experience was negative, but also a lot of it was very helpful towards my career. Um, and I think also to wrap up, I don't think they're doing terribly at the moment, but just kind of peripherally from what I hear through the grapevine, it does sound like things are leveling off a bit, and there's a little bit more struggle in um, acquiring new business. And so I feel like even just sticking with YrDocs, even if I got a pay raise, it wouldn't have necessarily been the best career move, just with the direction of YrDocs versus the direction of the current company I'm at, which is definitely has a lot of really great things going for it at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds like everything is an improvement because and also you're mentioning going from 75 calls a day to 25 to 40 a week. That seems like just so much more manageable.
Yeah, I mean, it's more manageable, but I think the more important part is it's way more engaging. Like, when you're making 75 calls a day, you're basically just waiting for someone to pick up the phone and do your best job at repeating the thing, not repeating the exact same things. Of course, you adapt to different situations, but at the end of the day, you're making 75 calls a day, and sometimes you get robotic. um, I mean, if you're a good sales rep, you minimize that, but it does happen even to the best of us. And I think with this job, like, I not only am I making so many less calls, but I'm having much more thoughtful conversations with the people that I'm with, the customers that I'm connecting with, and I'm involved very heavily in a lot of strategy around researching markets, researching target clients, and understanding different businesses within the same industry in a way that we change our pitches. And I feel like that's just so much more valuable than being able to tell an attorney that they can probably save, earn an extra, $5,000 a month. Like, it's cool, but it's just like not particularly profound.
Yeah. Well, very cool. I'm glad that you were able to move up in the world.
Me too. It's definitely been a journey, and there are always ups and downs with any job, but I'm definitely very appreciative for my current role. My manager, especially, is I will keep shouting her out. She is very supportive and has the capability to put me in the training that I want.
Yeah. Mr. G, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you guys so much for coordinating this finally, and definitely looking forward to seeing it out in the wild.
Wow, that's another great episode. Steven, what stood out for you?
Yeah, Jake, I think the weirdest part of this was the fact that Mr. G got hired for a position above the role he ended up getting. And just kind of what would like that's like me just getting hired as VP of product when I apply to be a product manager somewhere. And it just like, it's very strange. I've never been in that situation.
Yeah, on the one hand, you would think it's sort of a red flag of like, why are you offering me this job above what I applied for? But I would totally take the higher role too, because what an ego boost, right? You think, oh, maybe in 2 years I can work hard and become an account executive, and they're offering it to me right away. Of course, you would take it.
Oh, totally. I think my ego would also get in the way, and I would also totally take the job, only to probably be upset at the end result, just kind of how things turned out for Mr. G there. But maybe at the company it was just a complex bait and switch. Like maybe they weren't getting anyone to apply for the BDR position, so they just had a bunch of people apply to be an AE, and then just after it wasn't working out, they just demoted them back to the position they needed more heads for. I'd be, at that point, like you're really probably just too embarrassed to like restart your job search at that point after you already got a quote unquote promotion. Like you really don't want to go back out there being like, oh, I got demoted.
Right,
And you're probably
having to tell your family and friends like, oh, I only lasted 2 months in this job. You just much easier to say like, oh, I just there was a reorg and now I'm doing this other thing.
Yeah, totally. What stood out for you, Jake?
Being in sales is really hard. And what struck me specifically about Mr. G's circumstances is that he had a quota in the second month on the job. And I just think about all the jobs that I've had, and my second month, like I still don't know like what I'm doing at all. I don't know, who's responsible for what, or it's really just like you're still in that faking it stage. And so to have your salary dependent on this when you're still so new and still overwhelmed by the role, that's really tough.
And the thing about quotas, Jake, it's not just that second month he had to worry about it. He had to worry about it every single month for his career at the company the entire time. And the other big thing is that, in order to hit that quota, I had that experience doing cold calling, and it's tough. The amount of people that he had to call every single week to try and get people to sign up. Whew.
Yeah, I know. I think it was like 75 per week, and nowadays, like I never use the phone. Like maybe I make 75 calls a year, and that's really just my parents. And I think about like the amount of anxiety I get just calling my parents. I can't imagine calling complete strangers, trying to convince them to buy my software. Uh, it's really yeah. It's credit to Mr. G and all the salespeople out there. Can you imagine if we had to get if we had to get listeners by cold calling them?
Oh, it would not work out well. They would hang up as soon as they heard our voice, or just not pick up as well, because that's how I treat cold calls today with caller ID. But you know what? You won't expect a call from us in the next month with our next episode, because we're not going to force you to listen to it or try to force you to listen to it. But if you do listen to it, Jake and I will deeply appreciate it. So stay tuned for the next episode whenever it drops. Thanks for listening.